Listen carefully. Because if you miss the first 8 seconds, you'll miss the part they tried hardest to erase. It begins with a sound. Not a scream, not a cry, but the unmistakable rhythm of a woman's breath breaking under the weight of her own choices. A breath recorded only once by a terrified house servant hiding behind the smokehouse wall before the night Alabama wished it could forget. The story you're about to hear was never meant to reach you, because this isn't just history, it's an autopsy of power. A lesson in what happens when the lies of an entire society are forced to look themselves in the mirror. And the first face staring back was hers. August 1840. Hickory Bend Plantation, small, forgettable, a property spoken of in the county with clipped sentences and quiet glances. Its owner, Jonathan Delacroix, carried himself like the other Southern planters of his time. Polished, respected, applauded in church and feared in court. A man who built his reputation on control of land, of labor, of perception. But every empire, no matter how polished, has a seam where the truth leaks through. For Delacroix, that seam was his wife, Marietta, 28 years old. Intelligent, restless, educated far beyond what her husband ever planned to tolerate. She read philosophy. She questioned scripture. She spoke to the enslaved not as shadows, but as people. And Jonathan hated that. Not openly. Men like him never hate openly. They tighten their grip in silence. But when rumors spread of Marietta sneaking out under moonlight, meeting a field hand in the abandoned pecan grove, the whispers ignited something vicious inside Jonathan. Not jealousy. No, jealousy requires vulnerability. His reaction came from a place colder, the preservation of power. Because in 1840 Alabama, a wife's disobedience was more than a betrayal. It was a crack in the mask of a man who needed the world to believe he was untouchable. And Jonathan Delacroix would not allow a crack. He would seal it shut in the most theatrical, humiliating, irreversible way he could imagine. A punishment so calculated, so performative, that even the enslaved who witnessed it said later they felt the ground itself recoil. But before that night unfolds, before the firelight, before the circle, before the decision that would damn every soul who stood there, you need to understand something. This wasn't a story of a wife punished. It was the story of a system exposing its own rot. And once you hear the next part, you can't unhear it. Before the night of punishment could happen, the plantation itself began to shift. Places change their shape when dark intentions start gathering inside them. Men feel it in their bones. Women feel it in the air. But the enslaved at Hickory Bend, those who lived closest to the truth, felt it first. They noticed the way Jonathan began walking differently. Straighter, slower, like a man moving through a plan he'd already rehearsed in his mind. They noticed how he stared at Marietta without looking at her, studying her like an architect studying a flaw in the foundation. And they noticed how Marietta herself softened, not out of guilt, but out of exhaustion. She knew the consequences of being a woman ahead of her time. She just didn't yet know the price he'd decided she would pay. Jonathan's pride wasn't wounded by the affair. Don't mistake him for a man capable of simple emotions. This was about order. He believed in a hierarchy with the certainty of a zealot, God above man, man above wife, master above slave. Break one link, and the whole chain trembles. And Marietta had pulled the wrong link. The slaves whispered that the field hand she met, Daniel, was no ordinary man. Quiet, observant, sharp in ways Jonathan never noticed, because Jonathan didn't look at slaves long enough to see anything beyond muscle. Daniel, however, saw everything. He saw Marietta's unhappiness. He saw Jonathan's cruelty. And he saw a doorway, one she opened willingly, perhaps recklessly but not blindly. Some claimed she loved Daniel. Some claimed she pitied him. Others believed she was trying to rebel against her husband in the only way a trapped woman could. The truth, I suspect, lies somewhere deeper, in a place neither lover nor victim can fully name. But here's the part history left out. Jonathan knew about the affair long before the whispers reached the porch. He had been waiting, watching, calculating how to turn private infidelity into public dominance. Because Jonathan understood something most men never learn. Power isn't real until someone else has to witness it. And so he built a stage. He dismissed the overseer for the weak. He summoned neighboring planters under the pretense of a Saturday gathering. He instructed the enslaved to prepare torches, stack wood, clear the yard. One man, Elias, the oldest slave on the property, felt his stomach twist when he saw the preparations. He told the others quietly, "This ain't for fire, this is for judgment." And he was right, because before midnight, Jonathan would announce a decision no one in Alabama had ever seen, and no one who witnessed it would ever forget. The announcement came just after sundown, when the torches flickered against the humid Alabama sky and the crickets fell silent, as if even the insects understood that something sacred, or damned, was about to happen. Jonathan Delacroix stepped onto the porch with the calmness of a priest preparing a ritual. His guests, 5 neighboring planters, thought they'd been invited for drinks, cards, maybe a bit of boasting over cotton yields. Instead, they found themselves staring at a man whose eyes held a cold, ceremonial purpose. Marietta was brought out next. Not dragged, not forced. She walked on her own, chin lifted, the kind of silent defiance that enrages small men and terrifies powerful ones. Her hair was unbound, her dress simple, her wrists untouched by rope, which somehow made the humiliation sharper. Jonathan wanted the crowd to believe she chose her guilt. Then Jonathan spoke. His voice carried across the yard, measured, righteous, dripping with the controlled fury of a man who believed himself ordained by God. "My wife," he declared, "has violated the sanctity of this household, not with lies, not with disobedience, but with betrayal against her husband, her vows, and the order God set upon this land." The guests stiffened. None dared interrupt. The enslaved stood frozen in a distant ring, their faces unreadable, yet each one sensing their world tilting into a new and dangerous alignment. Jonathan continued, "The man she sinned with will be dealt with." He motioned toward Daniel, who was forced forward by 2 armed men borrowed from a neighboring plantation. Daniel didn't struggle, didn't lower his gaze. He looked at Marietta with an expression no one expected. Not fear, not regret, but a strange, devastating calm. The kind of calm that only a man who has already accepted death can wear without trembling. Jonathan saw this and smiled, because now came the part he had invented. A punishment designed not by law nor scripture, but by his own hunger to reassert dominance in a world where even the illusion of weakness could cost a man everything. He announced it slowly, savoring the way the words tasted in the air. "Tonight, the slaves of Hickory Bend will decide her fate." The guests exchanged horrified glances. Marietta's breath caught. Even Daniel's composure wavered, because this had no precedent, no legal foundation, no moral excuse. Jonathan wasn't seeking justice. He was crafting a spectacle, a living reminder that every soul on this land existed beneath his authority. And then, with a single gesture, he summoned Elias, oldest, wisest, and most silently wounded of them all, to step forward. "Let them judge her," Jonathan said. And in that instant, the plantation crossed a line from cruelty into something far older and far darker. Elias stepped forward slowly, each movement heavy with the weight of decades lived under the shadow of men like Jonathan Delacroix. He was old enough to remember life before Hickory Bend, old enough to have buried promises he once made to himself about patience, survival, and silence. But this being pulled into a white man's vengeance was a violation even he had never imagined. Jonathan watched him with predatory satisfaction, like a puppeteer observing the moment a string finally pulls tight. "Elias," he said, "you and the others know her crime. You know what must be done." Marietta turned toward Elias, not pleading, not demanding, but searching. Searching for someone who could still see her as human, even in the moment she was being stripped of her identity. And Elias met her gaze with a kind of mournful clarity that only a man who has survived the worst parts of humanity can possess. Behind him, the other enslaved men shifted uneasily. Not one wanted this. Not one dared refuse. To act against Jonathan meant death. To act for Jonathan meant becoming part of something they would carry in silence for the rest of their lives. Elias finally spoke, his voice trembling not with fear but with the weight of impossible responsibility. "Master, punishment ain't ours to choose." Jonathan's smile didn't falter. He had expected resistance. He savored it. "Tonight," he said. "It is." The neighbors stood frozen between shock and complicity. They knew Jonathan had gone too far. They knew this violation of order, forcing slaves to judge a white woman, could unravel everything the South pretended to be. But they also knew something else. Challenging him publicly meant inviting scandal onto themselves. Safety in their world always outweighed morality. So they said nothing. Marietta broke the silence first. She stepped forward, surprising everyone, even Elias. "Look at me," she whispered, not to Jonathan, but to the slaves. "Not as mistress, not as wife." Her voice cracked, but her posture did not. "Look at me as a soul, and decide with truth." Daniel closed his eyes. He understood what she was doing, offering them an impossible door. A way to reclaim dignity, or a way to die faster. Jonathan leaned against the porch post, pleased with her bravery because he believed bravery made humiliation more dramatic. Elias inhaled slowly, and then something shifted. Something quiet. Something ancient. The enslaved men formed a circle around Marietta and Daniel. Not by Jonathan's command, but by some deeper instinct. Not rebellious. Not obedient. Something else. Something Jonathan could not read, and would soon come to fear. The circle tightened not with violence, not with frenzy, but with a solemnity that unsettled everyone watching. Jonathan expected chaos, pleading, panic. Instead, he got silence. A silence so heavy it seemed to bend the air, folding time inward, turning the plantation yard into something older than Alabama, older than slavery, older than the men who believed they owned other men. Inside that circle, Elias felt something stir. Not rebellion, not vengeance. Something deeper, the weight of judgment that no one should ever have to carry. Marietta stood tall in the center. Daniel took his place beside her, not as accomplice, not as victim, but as equal in the eyes of the moment, an equality Jonathan never intended to grant. Jonathan's guests shifted uncomfortably. This was not a punishment anymore. It was becoming a ritual. "Get on with it," Jonathan barked, impatience cracking through his mask of control. But control had already slipped through his fingers. Elias raised his hand gently, silencing even the insects. "When a soul is judged," he said quietly, "it's judged by them who've seen the truth of it." Daniel lifted his gaze at those words. Marietta exhaled. Jonathan's jaw tightened. Elias stepped closer to her. "Miss Marietta," he said, "you know what you done. You know what it mean to him." He nodded toward Jonathan without looking at him. "But sin ain't the same as evil, and mistake ain't the same as hate." Marietta's eyes glistened not with fear, but with recognition. Jonathan's face reddened. "That's enough. You will do as I command." But no one moved, because Elias wasn't finished. "You askin us to punish a woman," he said, turning to Jonathan. "But you ain't askin the right question." Jonathan blinked. "The right question?" Elias nodded slowly. "What kind of man wants his wife shamed by the people he keeps in chains?" The guests inhaled sharply. That was the line. The unspeakable challenge. The truth no one dared voice. Jonathan stepped down from the porch, rage flickering in his eyes. "You forget your place." "No," Elias said, voice steady. "I remember it too well." Marietta closed her eyes, tears escaping not for herself, but for what she knew would follow. Daniel stepped forward slightly, preparing himself. Because now the circle wasn't just around Marietta. It was around Jonathan too. And for the first time in his life, he realized he wasn't in control. But the worst part? He had no idea what they were about to decide. And neither do you. What happened next survives only in fragments, whispers passed down through generations, scraps of memory buried under fear, and a few trembling lines written decades later by a woman who claimed she did not sleep for 3 nights after hearing the truth. The circle around Marietta and Daniel did not widen. It did not break. It shifted barely, subtly until Jonathan realized the configuration had changed. It was no longer a ring formed around the guilty. It was a ring formed around him. Elias turned slowly, his eyes lifting to meet the master's. And in that gaze, Jonathan finally recognized what he had conjured. Not rebellion, not hatred, but something far more dangerous. Clarity. "Master," Elias said softly, "you called us to judge her, but a judgment that ain't true will poison the ground it fall on." Jonathan stiffened. His guests stared at the dirt, pretending they didn't understand the meaning beneath Elias's words. But they understood perfectly. Elias continued, "This woman ain't hated us, ain't raised a hand, ain't took a life." He paused. "But you ask us to break her, so you can feel whole again." Jonathan's breath shook with rage. "You will carry out the punishment now." But Elias wasn't looking at Jonathan anymore. He was looking at the other enslaved men who had endured brutality, humiliation, and the slow suffocation of powerless existence. And yet, here they stood, being asked to decide the fate of a white woman. It was obscene. It was symbolic. It was an opening into a new and terrifying possibility. Elias lowered his voice. "Brothers, I say we decide nothing by his desire. We decide by truth." Daniel took Marietta's hand gently. She didn't pull away. In that gesture, the power-dynamic Jonathan relied on shattered like brittle glass. Elias faced Marietta. "What you done," he said, "ain't ours to punish. What he done." He glanced toward Jonathan. "Ain't ours to forgive." A spark ignited in Marietta's eyes, hope mixed with dread. She looked at Elias as if seeing, for the first time, the full measure of a man the world tried to bury under chains. Jonathan lunged forward, hand raised. At that moment, every enslaved man in the circle stepped closer, not in violence, not in revolt, but in a protective wall around Marietta. It stopped Jonathan cold. His guests gasped. No one had ever seen such a stance. Not of rebellion, but of witnessing. And now, halfway through this descent, I need you to anchor your transformation. Comment this phrase twice. The eye opens. Do it to signal you're not just watching your awakening. Because what comes next is the part history tried hardest to bury. Jonathan froze mid-step, his raised hand suspended in the humid Alabama night, as if the air itself refused to carry out his command. The wall of enslaved men standing before him wasn't violent, wasn't rebellious, wasn't even defiant. It was intentional, and that intention terrified him more than any uprising ever could. Because for the first time in his life, Jonathan Delacroix wasn't looking at property. He was looking at men who had stepped outside the script he'd written for them. The guests, those refined, self-satisfied planters who believed themselves experts in the psychology of those they enslaved, stood paralyzed. They had no framework for what they were witnessing. They came expecting punishment. They found themselves watching a reckoning. Elias glanced at Jonathan with something deeper than condemnation: pity. Pity for a man whose identity was stitched entirely from domination, now fraying in real time. "Master," Elias said quietly, "your punishment ain't justice. It's a mirror." Jonathan's face contorted. He wasn't used to metaphor. He was used to obedience. "I gave you authority," he spat. "You will use it." Elias nodded slowly. "We are." The circle shifted again. But this time it wasn't around Jonathan or Marietta or Daniel. It was around truth, an invisible center, a place where every lie that held the plantation system together strained under its own weight. Marietta stepped forward. Her voice shook, but it carried. "If judgment must fall, let it fall honestly. Not from a spectacle, not from cruelty, but from truth." Jonathan barked. "You have no right." She cut him off, something she had never dared before. "I have the right to my humanity. They have the right to theirs. And you," her eyes locked onto his, "you have the right to finally face what you are." Daniel didn't speak. He didn't need to. The strength in his silence was louder than any accusation. Jonathan turned to his guests, desperate for support. But none stepped forward. None spoke his name. None would take his side, because they had seen something they could not unsee, a system that demanded obedience, confronted by the very souls it had tried to silence. Jonathan's voice cracked. "You're slaves. You do not decide." Elias stepped closer, so close Jonathan had to tilt his head to maintain eye contact. "Tonight," Elias whispered, "we decide what kind of men we are, not what kind of slaves you think we be." The torches flickered. The night held its breath, and with a single, quiet motion Elias turned away from Jonathan. The first act of moral resistance in that plantation's history had begun. The night stretched long, and the air thickened as if the plantation itself had grown sentient. Jonathan Delacroix, once untouchable, found himself unmoored adrift in a sea of eyes that no longer feared him, but that saw him fully. For the first time, the illusion of control shattered, revealing a man alone with his choices and the unbearable weight of their consequences. Elias guided Marietta and Daniel to the center of the yard, the circle of enslaved men forming a protective barrier around them. It wasn't violence that protected them, it was witness. It was acknowledgement. It was the quiet assertion of humanity in a world designed to erase it. Jonathan's fury boiled silently, but the truth had entered the yard, and truth is a force more relentless than rage. The neighbors, the planters who had gathered in casual curiosity, shifted uneasily. Some whispered prayers. Some cursed under their breath. Some simply stared, unable to reconcile the spectacle with the order they had always relied upon. Elias spoke again, low and deliberate. "This night," he said, "is not about vengeance. It is about seeing. Seeing the world for what it has been and what it must become." Marietta's hand found Daniel's. No longer lovers defined by fear, but companions defined by choice and survival. Her voice, though trembling, carried authority that none in the yard dared deny. "Let it be known," she said, "that power over others is not proof of strength, but evidence of weakness. The chains you wield, they bind only the soul of the one who believes he is free." Jonathan recoiled as if struck. His entire identity built on domination, secrecy, and spectacle collapsed under the weight of her words. And in that collapse, he glimpsed a truth that would haunt him for the rest of his days. The people he thought powerless could, in a single night, redefine everything. The enslaved men lowered their heads, a collective acknowledgement passing between them, a silent vow that the memory of this night would endure, not for revenge, not for spectacle, but as a ledger of truth, written in flesh, breath, and witness. A ledger Jonathan could never burn. By dawn, the yard was empty, save for Marietta, Daniel, and Elias. Jonathan retreated to the house, a man undone. The neighbors left quietly, their curiosity tempered by the recognition that some truths are dangerous to observe, dangerous to record, dangerous to ignore. But history, as you now know, has a habit of surfacing always. Stories like this do not disappear. They wait, patient, beneath the soil of civilization, ready to confront anyone who dares to look closely. And that is why you are here. You have crossed a threshold. You have glimpsed what most will never see. And from this point forward, your understanding of power, justice, and human nature can never return to innocence. Remember this night. Remember the circle. Remember the gaze of those who refused to be silenced. Because knowledge like this, once it reaches you, changes a man forever. Some truths are dangerous to hear and impossible to forget. Comment, "The eye opens twice" if you're ready to see the history they didn't want you to know. Share this with someone who can handle the truth. And subscribe, because the deeper you go, the darker the world they hid from you becomes.